introduce our next guest with a little bit of a heavy heart because he represents an archdiocese that is an arch rival to New York in a way that is outside of the bounds of what we're doing here today. I want to be clear that I admire our next guest on many, many levels, but I'm not sure as to where his allegiances lie in the area of baseball. We are down 1-0 right now, and we hope to get the game back tonight. But our next guest is also born in Ohio, and there's a team that's being represented in the American League playoffs from Ohio. So I think I'm just going to ask Seán Cardinal O'Malley to give us a little blessing for the Yankees, if he would be so kind. I think you have to be a Yankee fan when they're in the playoffs. I was, a few years ago in Boston, we were doing Magnificat weekend, and my daughter was with me, and the Yankees had just lost in the playoffs, and so to the Red Sox. And I said to her, "Who do we root for now?" She said, "Well, we're in Boston." So I told the congregation, I think I'm going to root for the Red Sox, but it's wicked had. And if we're ready, I'd like to welcome Seán Cardinal O'Malley, and we thank him for the special effort that he made today to get here after the wedding of his niece, Seán Cardinal O'Malley.
Good evening, everyone. I'm glad we have some Sox fans here. I was getting worried. Well, what a great joy to be here tonight. And I want to, first of all, congratulate Magnificat for bringing us together. They make such an extraordinary contribution to the life of our church through Magnificat, promoting liturgical spirituality and the life of prayer of our people. And we're so grateful to Pierre-Marie Dumont and to Vincent Montagna, their families, and for all of the people that work so hard to make this extraordinary magazine available to us and have been doing it for 20 years in the United States. And I also want to say a word of thanks to the outgoing editor-in-chief of the American edition, Father Peter John Cameron, who has done a fantastic job. He's brought spiritual instruction and inspiration to hundreds of thousands of people who use Magnificat every day as an aid to their spiritual life. In the days before television, as a child, every Saturday, all of us kids would go to the movies for the matinees, and then to the parish church for Saturday afternoon confessions. As my father used to tell us, when it's time to get your hair cut, it's time to go to confession. He presumed that our sins were growing just as fast as our fur, I think. The matinee would begin at 1 o'clock. We grew up on Western cowboy films, 25 cents, the Saturday matinee double feature, newsreel, there was no CNN in those days, cartoons, and a serial film that continued from week to week and always ended with a very dramatic scene geared to bring the audience back to see if the hero, who fell from an airplane without a parachute into shark-infested waters, while at the same time under fire from poisonous darts from cannibals, will he survive? Well, of course he will, but you had to wait until next week to find out how. These serials gave us the expression cliffhanger to indicate the perilous, uncertain ending. Actually, in those days, Westerns comprised about 1/4 of all the films in the 20th century, and about 1/4 of primetime television when television finally started. The hero cowboy was always a rugged individual, completely self-reliant, who by his own efforts and determination was able to overcome all adversity. Our cowboy heroes were joined by Ayn Rand heroes, the private detectives of the noir genre, Rambo, Rocky, and Luke Skywalker. Individualism and competition became our most important national values as personified in our cultural icons. To a certain extent, these rugged individuals who enjoyed hero status have been supplanted by our celebrities, many of whom are simply famous for being famous, and we often have no idea how they entered our consciousness. We love them for being who they are, not for what they do. Sometimes celebrity is warranted by talent in singing, sports, entertainment, or because of intellectual prowess or good looks. And because we live in a culture addicted to entertainment, celebrities are a very important part of our life. I often share with people the story how I was once invited to a state dinner at the White House. The president of Brazil was visiting, and they wanted to have a Portuguese-speaking bishop present. When an O'Malley showed up, they were all very surprised. They sat me down next to President Bush Sr., who was head of state at that moment and whom I recognized immediately. On my other side was a lovely young woman who introduced herself as Gloria Estefan. I said to her, "Do you work in the White House?" She said, "No, Father, I'm a famous singer." I said, "You obviously don't sing Gregorian chant." She was a good sport and understood that a poor friar might not be totally conversant with pop culture. Yet the truth is that we're all immersed in a culture that lionizes celebrities and often presents heroes who are the embodiment of the extreme individualism rampant in our society. In the church, we have the saints as our role models and heroes. The truth is, we were placed on this earth to take care of each other. For the unbeliever, the universe and life itself are the result of chance, an accident. For the believer, the universe and life are the result of love. That's the fundamental difference. So often the popular culture and the media, who are the great proselytizers of our age, preach the most stultifying kind of consumer existence, convincing us to worship the gods of commerce and money and selfish advancement above all else. We're told that all that really matters is to acquire things, to wear the right clothes, to drive the right cars, to live in the right place. Then everything will be all right. The truth is that the invariable losses and sufferings that intrude even to the most carefully planned and orchestrated life have a way of disrupting things. A life of faith with a sense of purpose and mission is what brings fulfillment. In our world where people put their philosophy of life on their bumper stickers, I saw a great t-shirt. It said, "The one who has the most money when he dies wins." It sounds kind of absurd when you read it on the t-shirt, but many people live their lives as if that's what it were all about. It's only by being part of a community of faith, to be part of a worshiping community, that can sustain you and nurture idealism and sense of purpose. I know that a popular saying nowadays is, "Oh, I'm spiritual but not religious." That means I can have a relationship with God without being part of the church. However, Jesus is the bridegroom. He's never the widower. He doesn't exist separate from his bride. Jesus has taught us very clearly that discipleship is never a solo flight. We learn to be a people of faith the way we learn a language, by being part of a community that speaks that language. Recently, I was invited to the great Marian shrine of Altötting in Bavaria to celebrate Mass in the cell of St. Conrad, a Capuchin brother who was porter at the shrine for 40 years. In this tiny porter's room, there are two windows. One that allowed the saint to see the tabernacle in the church. The other window faced the road, and through that window the saint could see the throngs of pilgrims, of suffering humanity coming to ask for help to cope with hunger and poverty. They came seeking forgiveness and mercy. Those two windows for me represent the path of St. Conrad's holiness. Pope Francis, in his reflection on holiness, underscores the centrality of prayer and community. St. Conrad's windows that opened the path to holiness in his life were precisely prayer and community. Holiness consists in an habitual openness to the transcendent expressed in prayer and adoration. Holiness is nurtured in community where we learn to wash each other's feet as Jesus taught us at the first Eucharist. In a world where divisions and extreme individualism are threatening the planet, the antidote is holiness. Our community of faith has responsibility to prepare the world to bring healing and peace by unleashing the power of love that is holiness. That is what humanizes us, perfecting God's image within us. We are made in the image and likeness of God, and that's the source of our dignity. That image is made manifest when we live God's love as protectors and caregivers of those around us, and indeed of our very planet, our common home. The world has enough cowboys and celebrities. We need men and women capable of loving and serving, who, like Christ, are prepared to make a gift of themselves to others. God has made us for friendship, not to be isolated as an autonomous self that seeks only one's own advantage and well-being apart from others. Recently, Pope Francis published that very moving invitation to embrace our vocation to holiness in Gaudete et Exsultate. To be holy is to be fully human, to realize our full potentiality. Our task, in turn, is to help others to be fully human, to grow in sanctity. Pope Francis said, "Don't be afraid of holiness. It will take away none of your energy, vitality, or joy. On the contrary, you will become what the Father had in mind when He created you, and you will be faithful to your deepest self." To depend on God sets us free from every form of enslavement and leads us to recognize our great dignity. The Holy Father urges us to set our sights higher, to allow us to be loved and liberated by God. He says holiness does not make us less human, since it is an encounter between our weakness and the power of God's grace. For in the words of Leon Blois, when all is said and done, the only great tragedy in life is not to become a saint. Pope Francis has given us a very accessible, practical lesson on Christian holiness. He shows us that holiness is following Jesus, experiencing the mysteries of his life. It consists in being united in his death and resurrection, but also in reproducing in our own lives various aspects of Jesus' earthly life. His hidden life at Nazareth, a life of family, of work, of hospitality and prayer. It means experiencing his life in community with the apostles and disciples, his closeness to the outcasts, the simplicity of his lifestyle, the words and deeds that betoken his self-sacrificing love. Pope Francis holds up the Sermon on the Mount with the Beatitudes as the Christian's identity card. So if anyone asks what we must do to be a good Christian, the answer is clear. We have to do, each in our own way, what Jesus told us in the Sermon on the Mount. In the Beatitudes, with their promises of happiness to those who are poor, meek, peacemakers, compassionate, we find a portrait of the Master, which we are called upon to reflect in our own lives. We must let the Sermon on the Mount unsettle us, challenge us, demand a real change in the way that we live. In the 25th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, Jesus expands on the beatitude that calls the merciful blessed. This gospel reveals the holiness pleasing to God's eye and one clear criterion on which we will be judged. I was hungry, and you gave me to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me to drink. I was sick, you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. This gospel passage is not simply an invitation to charity. It is, as Pope Francis says, a page of Christology, which sheds a ray of light on the mystery of Christ. In this call to recognize him in the poor and suffering, we see revealed the very heart of Jesus, his deepest feelings and choices, which every saint seeks to imitate. Yes, we're called upon to be protectors and caregivers. We must not be indifferent to the suffering and injustice on our doorstep. Our very existence is a result of love. We have our origins and our destiny in God's love. In our connectedness to God, we're connected to each other. Our God has entrusted this world to us. Our task is, as our Jewish brothers and sisters say, to repair the world, tikkun olam. Our world needs a lot of repair, a lot of caregivers and protectors. Lone rangers and celebrities won't cut it. We need saints. Every year I accompany hundreds of students to Washington, D.C. for the pro-life march in January. I have been at every one since the beginning, but I hope before I die it won't be necessary to go to Washington every January. One year, as part of our pro-life pilgrimage, we visited the Holocaust Museum while we were there. I was struck by a replica of a letter that was projected on the wall from a Holocaust survivor by the name of Chaim Ganot. The letter is addressed to educators. He says, "My eyes have seen what no man should witness. Gas chambers built by learned engineers, children poisoned by educated physicians, infants killed by trained nurses, women and children shot and burned by high school and college graduates. So I am suspicious of education. My request is help your students to become more human. Your efforts must never produce learned monsters, skilled psychopaths, educated Eichmanns. Reading, writing, and arithmetic are important only if they serve to make people more human. We've seen how technology and science can be put at the service of selfishness and evil. At home, we have a great photograph of my Irish grandparents in Lakewood, Ohio. My grandfather had one of the first automobiles in our town, and we have photographs of him and my grandmother in their Model T Ford or whatever it was, wearing their goggles, the dusters, my grandfather in his leather cap, and my grandmother with a big hat tied firmly with a scarf under her chin, prepared for those life-threatening velocities of 15 miles an hour. But before they died, my grandparents lived to see a man placed on the moon. The 20th century was the greatest century of scientific and technological progress in the history of humanity. Television, the internet, communications, cures and treatments for so many diseases that had been fatal. So many wonderful discoveries and inventions that make our lives easier and richer. At the same time, the 20th century was the most violent century in the history of the planet. 2 world wars, the Holocaust, the atomic bomb, apartheid, legalized abortion, and so many examples of the destruction of people, the abuse of the environment, and the eroding of human values. That's why Chaim Gunot's letter is so prophetic. Science and technology can expand our knowledge of the world around us, but they can never teach us the value of things or the meaning of our existence, the purpose and mission of our life. Our faith is a light that helps us to see deeper into reality, to discover the loving presence of God. And in discovering God, we discover our own identity. We discover who we are, why we're here, what we have to do with our lives. Oh, this wisdom begins when we discover how awesome our God is. Then we discover that we are not here by accident. We're here because of God's love, and our life has a purpose. Being a protector and caregiver demands courage and generosity. These are the people that are repairing our world and holding our hope for the future. Solidarity is an expression of the great commandment that calls us to form a community among people that will enable us to overcome the structures of sin and oppression that dog humanity. Above the human and natural bonds already so strong, faith leads us to see a new model of the unity of the human race. The Holy Father insists that solidarity is not sentimentality or some vague compassion or empathy for the suffering of so many, but rather it's a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good, because we are all really responsible for all. Solidarity is about being protectors of the gifts and caretakers of each other. Let me finish by sharing with you one of my favorite parables, a parable the Japanese have. They tell the story of a man who lived in a beautiful home on the top of a mountain. And each day he would go out in his garden and take a walk and look at the ocean below. And one day as he was out walking, he saw that there was a tsunami on the horizon rushing toward the shore. And then he saw a group of his neighbors down on the beach having a picnic. So he wanted to warn them. He waved his arms, he shouted. They were too far away. They couldn't see him or hear him. So you know what that man did? He went into his beautiful home and he set it on fire. And when his neighbors down on the beach saw the smoke and the flame, some of them said, "Let's climb the mountain and help our neighbor to save his home." And the others said, "Oh, that mountain is so steep and we're having so much fun. You go." Well, the ones who climbed the mountain to help their friend save his home were saved. But those who stayed on the beach, when the tidal wave hit the shore, were swept out to sea and perished. Sometimes when we perform a work of mercy or an act of charity or of justice, we think we're doing God a favor and we congratulate ourselves. But actually, we're climbing that mountain of love that draws us closer to God and to salvation. The only real success in life, as John Paul II said over and over again, is to make a gift of ourselves. This is the success that I wish for all of us, that we may be capable of making a gift of ourselves to God and to others. And in so doing, we will become protectors of the gifts, caregivers to each other, and a sign of hope in a world divided by the extreme individualism and materialism of the age. We need to create a space where missionary disciples can find community and family to nurture their ideals and set their hearts on fire with the most transformative energy in the world, the power of love to fill minds with the wisdom of the gospel. God bless you.